Hello, everyone, and welcome to this introduction to the podcast edition of this week's program. I had the most amazing conversation with Professor Edward Watts of the University of California at San Diego. He's the author of a number of books on Rome. He's got a new one that he's just finished and will be out in a year or so, a 1,200-year history of Rome, which I just can't wait to have. He's a very clear writer. He's an amazing scholar. He just got back from a trip to Rome. He was telling me about it before we went on the air. It was amazing. He got to go in with his conference with a group of other classicists to the Senate building in the Forum. I've seen it, 30 times, but never been in it. It's possible to get in it. They had a session in it, and it changed the way he thought about the way the Roman Senate worked. Because of the acoustics of the building and so on. It was absolutely amazing. And that's before we started to record. And the question that I wanted to ask him was, how does a nation in collapse create a new narrative that can build a consensus of most of the people of the country? So when Rome collapsed between, say, 200 BC and 44 BC, or even after, Rome was in a state of collapse. The Republic was dead. And believe me, it was infinitely worse than what we're going through, because there were proscription lists of people that to be killed and rounded up, tortured and killed, including people from very prominent families and so on. So here we are. And out of the collapse of Rome came Virgil's Aeneid, which was sort of state-sponsored propaganda. That's to put it too starkly, but it was a commissioned piece of work. And in the Aeneid, one of the world's greatest books, which was universally read until about 30 years ago by everybody everywhere in the West, the Aeneid creates a new narrative for Rome dating back to the Trojan Wars, but culminating in the coming of Augustus to bring a Pax Romana to the world. And that book became the centerpiece of how Rome understood itself for 1,000 years, really, and how we understand Rome, even to this day. And so what's going to knit us back together now that on the one hand we have leftists who say it's been about racism and sexism and xenophobia and so on from the very beginning, and on the right people who say, how dare you ever apologize for this country, we've done nothing wrong, or what few things we've done wrong, we've self-corrected, and we're the greatest thing that ever happened to humanity. The distance between those two views is very large, and it's going to be the platform in which the 250th birthday of the country is played out, and I dread it, frankly. So Professor Ed Watts has been a friend of mine for a number of years. I so admire him, and I urge you to read his books. The one that I would recommend that you read immediately is Mortal Republic, How Rome Fell into Tyranny. That was 2018. 2021, he wrote The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome, The History of a Dangerous Idea. And then he has a book on the final pagan era of ancient history. That was published in 2015. And those are the books already out, and several others, but those are the ones I recommend, particularly Mortal Republic. And it's written in a way that people who are not classicists or experts in classical culture can readily enjoy. And as I say to him at the end of this interview, that as I read Mortal Republic a few years ago, which is specifically and solely about Rome, but every 6 or 7 pages I would say to myself, is he talking about us? Because, of course, there are some really interesting parallels, none so pronounced as at the present moment. And we get into that in a tiny, careful way towards the end of this remarkable interview. This is one of the best interviews that I've ever been involved with. I'm thrilled by it. I could have spent 2 or 3 or 4 more hours talking to Ed Watts. I begged him to let me come with him to Rome one of these days and get his own tour of the city. He's just an amazing human being. It's been said over and over and over again, are we Rome? Or have we moved from the Republic to an empire? He's amazing. He's absolutely 100% amazing. And I hope you will respond to this program and let me know what you think. But think about this for yourselves. We don't have a national narrative. We all grew up with one, the pioneers and the Western movement and Conestoga wagons and so on and so forth. Now, that narrative has been shattered by the Cultural Revolution of the last 40 years in the United States, and we can't think that way anymore, but we're not prepared. We haven't figured out what a new consensus narrative looks like. And what struck me most interesting in what Professor Watts was saying is that in some respects, Rome offers us a solution that, normally we think that Rome was just a brute force and that we're infinitely better off than they were. But we tend to think of Rome as brutal. But he shows in his books that we have a great deal to learn from Rome that can help us get through the handful of most significant issues in American life. So I'm just honored to be able to know such a person and to know a number of such people, some of the most extraordinary minds of the country. And it's because of the morphing that we did from the Jefferson Hour into Listening to America. I'm just getting started here. I'm in the midst of phase 3 of the Great Steinbeck Tour. It ends just before Thanksgiving. Then I will take the winter off. If by off I mean I won't be in an Airstream, but I'll be doing all the other things that I'm constantly doing. And then I go back out on the road in late April to follow the Lewis and Clark Trail all the way across the United States. And I can't wait for that. That's sort of something I've been working on for 30 years off and on. Anyway, Professor Edward Watts, W-A-T-T-S, Endowed Chair of Classics at University of California, San Diego. So ltamerica.org is where you want to be for all of that. And I hope you follow along my travels there, but also at the Listening to America Facebook site. So that for now. Let's go to the show. Help us if you can. This is one of the great times of my life, and I want us to have a bigger megaphone. We'll see you soon. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Listening to America. I have across from me my friend Edward Watts of the University of California at San Diego, a classicist who has a number of books: Mortal Republic, How Rome Fell into Tyranny, The Final Pagan Generation, which is 2015, and The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome, The History of a Dangerous Idea, among others. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you.
So good to have you back. You've been on this program a couple of times before. You're my resident classicist. We've been talking before the program about your recent trip to Rome, and it just sounds fabulous. But as you know, I'm really concerned about the 250th birthday of the United States, which is coming on July 4th, 2026. From a Roman perspective, that's a pretty short national history. But as you know, we patterned ourselves in many respects after what we took to be the Republic of Rome. Goose Creek in the District of Columbia was renamed the Tiber. We have a capital. We have a Senate. Rostrums. Etc. So there was a kind of a self-conscious, Plutarchian, Livy-esque kind of feel in the Founding Fathers, and they wanted us very much to be what they took to be Rome when it was an ideal republic. And so, from time to time in America, we ask ourselves, are we Rome, and are we in collapse, and is this the empire, and is pro football our gladiatorial sport, or maybe it's pro wrestling or whatever. And I love the subtitle of your book, The History of a Dangerous Idea. When we first talked, I remember asking you, Professor Watts, are we Rome? And you said, we should be pretty cautious about that. The second time we talked, you said, it's not looking good. I'm really interested in your thoughts about all of this, and particularly with respect to narrative. Does America still have a narrative idea of who we are, what our values are, what our purpose in the world is? And I could think of nobody more appropriate to talk about that with than you. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I always enjoy talking and getting my sort of brain moving, because these ideas that you bring up are incredibly fascinating and also so creative and innovative. And I think in this context, you're exactly right that societies, especially complex and large societies, are in a sense held together by national ideas. And stories and narratives that give them a sense of what the common project should be.
The common project is a great word. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think in Rome, the challenging thing that we have as Roman historians is, the Roman state lasts a really, really long time. So the book I just finished, traces it across 2,000 years. And the thing that's remarkable about it is this is a Roman state that, of course, starts, in Italy with people who speak Latin and are pagans, and it ends in Constantinople with people who are Greek speakers who are Christian. And yet it's the same state. It just evolves over time. And the reason Romans are able to do this is there's a national idea, and I use national quite deliberately. I think that the Romans did create something that is pretty close to what we would consider a nation, and it's bound together by specific ideas. A really important one is that the Roman state is something that grows and incorporates new people. It has always been that. And so the earliest stories that Romans tell about themselves are stories of incorporation and a process of building a community that has new people in it. So the stories of Romulus founding the city of Rome is, set up by Romulus and then immediately populated by these outcasts, these exiles, these slaves, these people who are criminals. And they come in and they find redemption in this new place. And then there is this horrible moment where they open the brand new city. They invite, the neighboring Sabines. The Sabines come in, they kidnap the women, and then they marry the women, and they come to an agreement with the Sabines, who then try to attack and bring the women back. According to the Roman tradition, they establish an integrated monarchical system where Sabines have a place as well. And so the state is always, from its very earliest development, about creating a polity that incorporates new people, new ideas, and new structures, and does it in such a way that makes itself better. That's a story that I think we can identify with in the United States.
To prepare for today, I've looked back through the Aeneid, and as you know, in Book 8, the Shield of Aeneas, which is Virgil's analog to the Shield of Achilles from Homer's Iliad, begins with the two stories you told. It tells the story of Romulus and Remus, which is essentially an outlaw story and a fratricide, and then it tells the story of what used to be called the rape of the Sabine women, the inviting of the Sabines in for a festival, the kidnapping of the women, incorporating them, coming to peace with the Sabines, and on and on and on. And the shield ends with the coming of Augustus, standing in the center, triumphant, over what's now an empire, no longer really a republic. And so here's the most important piece of Latin literature of the early empire, written in some sense to please Augustus, but also to knit together a civil war-torn country that's been in civil strife for a couple of hundred years, including the assassination of Julius Caesar and so on. So here's a country that's a nation that's in real trouble. And Augustus comes in, mops up the war at Actium, establishes himself, sort of pretends to be a republican. Everyone kind of knows the trope, but they're okay with it because they like the idea that they can still pretend to be a republic. And Virgil is sort of engaged to write this great poem that will somehow craft a new narrative that justifies this, anticipates it, and projects it into the future. Is that a fair reading?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what Virgil's trying to do. I think the one thing that I've really come to realize in tracing, the next 1,200 years of Roman history after Augustus, we tend to see this as a binary, right? We tend to see the shift from republic to empire as a black and white shift, from freedom to autocracy. It's interesting that Romans don't. Some do, right? Tacitus talks about this as a binary. But he's writing in a very unique moment, and he's writing more or less to tell the history of the past, to talk about things that are actually happening 100, 120 years later. For a lot of Romans, when Augustus says he reestablished the republic, they sort of believe him. And the thing that's interesting about this is they continue to sort of believe this right to the very end of the state. So there's a great letter that's written in 1203 AD by the Byzantine Emperor Alexius II, who writes to the Pope while the Crusaders are on their way to take Constantinople and depose him in favor of a pretender who claims that he has legitimacy because he's the son of a previous emperor. And the Roman emperor writes, the Roman/Byzantine emperor, I mean, he calls himself the Roman emperor, and he is, but we call him a Byzantine emperor. He writes to the Pope and he says, look, you think because you're from Western Europe that this person has a biological right to the throne. That's not how we work, right? We are a state where power is not vested in individuals, but individuals serve at the pleasure and at the direction of their fellow citizens. And so we are chosen as leaders, not because it's our property and it's our inheritance and we biologically are entitled to it, but because other Romans are representing the entire polity and they decide we should rule. And so nobody can say, I deserve to be Roman emperor because my dad was. We are not that kind of a state. So even 1,200 years after Augustus, and long after Virgil's Aeneid, Romans still believe that there's somewhere on the spectrum between republic and autocracy, and they haven't moved all the way to autocracy. I mean, they aren't exactly, the Republic of Cicero, but they're not totally autocratic either. They function differently from the monarchies that exist elsewhere in the world. And so, what Virgil is doing, in a sense, is providing Romans with a way to understand not a shift in a binary, not a movement from freedom to autocracy, but a shift along a spectrum where what they've done is they've become less free, maybe, but not entirely unfree. And so, it's a shift that they have to learn to understand in terms that are appropriately Roman. These terms of reinvention, these terms of reincorporation, and these terms of kind of redemption. And I think that's the Roman national narrative forever, right? You can come here as somebody who is a slave. One of the second to last Roman king came to Rome as a slave and was, not only freed, but became the ruler of the state. You can come here as an outsider.
Amazing. I'm talking to Edward Watts, endowed professor of classics at UC San Diego, and it's always so delightful to talk with you. I hope we can go to Rome together one of these days, and I can see your tour.
It.
I'd love it. I'd give anything for this. But anyway, back to Virgil for a moment. So for those who don't know, the epic is about Aeneas leaving the ruins of the burning of Troy, carrying his father on his shoulders, leaving, unfortunately, his wife behind, taking his son, having a kind of a version of Odysseus's struggles as he moves west, helps to found what will become Rome. We stand for order and law and roads and aqueducts and creation of systems of governance that can incorporate peoples from all over the known world. That's who we are. It's a wonderful mission statement, isn't it?
And it's exactly it's exactly right. So about a generation earlier, Cicero writes about Romans, and he compares the Roman mission statement about politics to what Greeks do. And he says, in essence, Greeks theorize what they want to do. We just do it, right? The building of the Roman state is the contribution. It's based on the contribution of thousands of people who all do something practical, right? They are not sitting there thinking about what would be a nice ideal for a state. They're instead sitting down and making that state happen. And this is the idea that I think Virgil's also bringing out, right? Romans figure out how to do it. Greeks, they talk about it, and it's beautiful and it's elegant and it's, inspiring, but it doesn't exist. And what Romans do is they just build it and they fix it and they refine it. But I think the other thing that's really important about what you mentioned is, this is a society that is deeply invested in the systems that they have built. They do not function as a society that blows things up just for the sake of doing so, right? And they understand that these institutions are important. These systems are functional, and these systems can also get out of date, and you need to rebuild them or repair them.
Romulus and Remus, the Sabine women, the Gauls attacking Rome, the Battle of Actium. Some of this is historically verifiable with a mythological deepening, and some of this is just myth, right? Did the Romans buy it when they hear this story, that Aeneas comes from Troy as a refugee and Romulus and Remus and all this? Do they really think this is true in the deepest authenticity? Or do they think, yeah, that's our story and we're glad it's still part of the narrative?
That is a tricky point. So this is a story that the Aeneas story is something that we think comes in through Magna Graecia for the Greek cities in southern Italy, and it comes relatively late. So the story of Romulus and Remus and the suckling by the wolf, there's visual evidence, at least, that is quite old. So they had that story for a long time. But then as Rome becomes important and it becomes clear that this Roman polity from its very earliest point is something that has all of these other influences, right? There are very clear Greek influences. Even in the period where our history is like impressionistic more than real, there's very clear Etruscan influences from the north. This is never an ethnically pure society, nor would it ever claim to have been. This gives all kinds of people the opportunity to kind of insert their narratives into it. And this is why you have that crazy Hercules story. This is also why you have people from southern Italy who are Greek speakers inserting a kind of Greek-derived mytho-history that connects Rome to Greek events, right? I mean, if Romans are Trojans, then you can understand the interaction that Rome is having with the Greek world in the 3rd century BC when it starts conquering the Greek world. a world that is far more economically, militarily, politically, culturally, artistically sophisticated than the Romans. So, did Romans believe all of this stuff? Well, I think probably yes and no. There's a moment in Livy where he's writing about an event that isn't particularly well documented, and Livy says, "Yeah, I don't really know what happened, but this is kind of truthy, right? Like it seems close enough." And I think that that's probably where the Romans are with this kind of story, right?
That's a
Do they
great.
believe it? Ah.
That's really great. It's truthy. So, Stephen Colbert, another addition to human discord. We need to take a break. When we come back, I want to shift the scene to the United States. You're listening to a very interesting special edition of Listening to America with my friend, Professor Watts of UC San Diego. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the special edition of Listening to America. Edward Watts, Professor of Classics, endowed Professor of Classics at UC San Diego. A new book. What's the new book?
The new book is A History of Rome from Beginning to End. We're working on the title, but the working title right now is Romans, the History of the World's Longest Lived State.
And are you finished or nearly finished?
It is drafted and in production. So the date is next fall.
That's a big brush to cross American and European and world culture, but I can't wait to read it. So as soon as you're ready to share it, I'm ready to read it. I love your books, and the reason I got to know you at all was that I read the book about the ends of the Republic. It really struck me that there was something to talk about here. Mortal Republic, how Rome fell into tyranny. I'm guessing you would maybe adjust that title just a little bit given your more recent insights about all this, but we'll leave that for the moment. I want to turn to the United States. So I made a little list this morning, Ed, about America's narrative, which used to be America's narrative. I won't give you the full details, but Columbus bumps into the Western Hemisphere in 1492, Lexington and Concord, the coming of the American Revolution, the Louisiana Purchase and the fur trade and the Westering movement and so on. There are some similar attempts to reconcile the narrative. Richard Slotkin has a really interesting new book on this very subject. Then the Indian Wars end at Wounded Knee. Coming of the 20th century, America becomes a reluctant empire. We like to say we became a reluctant empire. We were forced into world hegemony thanks to World Wars I and II. We defeat the communism, and we begin to think that it's the end of history, but then Islamic radicalism crushes our happy trope and so on. As you know, that narrative can't survive. It no longer gets enough consensus to be the American narrative, because if you take, for example, the 1619 Project that the New York Times began in 2019, saying, look, folks, it's been about race, slavery, race oppression, apartheid, systemic racism from the very beginning, and it never ends. And no matter what the Founding Fathers said, that's how we actually are. And by the way, America's growth came at the expense of the indigenous peoples of the continent, where there was often real genocide, but always cultural genocide. So the new critique, which, as you know, you're an academician, this intense critique that you see at Brown and Columbia and Berkeley and other places, probably at UCSD too, says it's been a sham from the beginning. The Enlightenment was a rhetorical front for garden variety power politics. That the American dream is a kind of self-serving mythos that is not backed by the facts. So that's a short summary of what's going on there. On the other end of the far other end of the spectrum, the one that's really angry right now is saying, no, never apologize for this country. Yes, we've made a few mistakes, but we're the best thing that ever happened to the world. You cannot call into question the basic nobility of the American experiment. That's where we are. And when I look at the celebration or the commemoration on July 4th, 2026, I feel metis, I feel terror, because this is going to be the culture wars on steroids, I think. You tell me if I'm wrong, and you will know much better than I don't think we have a narrative anymore that we can all agree upon. And because we don't have a narrative, we're in a cultural paralysis, one expression of which is our political paralysis. Does that make any sense?
I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think that the Romans, in a way, can help us think in a new fashion about this. And I'll preface this by saying there's one very big difference that I do not know how to rectify that the Romans did not face, and that's race. The United States has, in a sense, two tracks of narrative, one of which the Romans would certainly recognize, the other of which I think the Romans would really not understand. In the Roman state, Rome was, of course, a slave society. And if you read a lot of the stuff in the 19th century that talks about, slave societies, they're directly referencing the Romans. They're talking about this in really, they really like what the Romans were doing. What they miss is that the Roman slave system was something that it's very hard for us to understand, because in the short term, it's horrible. I mean, it's worse, actually, I think, than what you saw in the 19th century South, because there were slaves who literally were just, worked to death. Literally, that's the job.
In
Right.
Rome, in the Roman world.
In Rome, yeah. I mean, it's worse than getting sent to one of the sugar plantations in Louisiana. If you were a mine slave in Rome, you were supposed to work until you die. You weren't going to have any other fate. But in the long run, Rome freed its slaves and made them citizens, and made their kids emperors, right? I mean, some Roman kings were born slaves, one was born a slave and became a king. The Emperor Pertinax was born the son of a slave, right? I mean, he was a free, he was from one generation before, he was from a slave family. And so Rome had horrible, horrible conditions for slaves. But then this path where slaves were not seen as biologically enslaved. This was a condition that you could leave. And if you left, you were integrated into society, not just as a permanent underclass, but potentially you ran the society. And so this is something that, because our slavery in the 19th century, especially, was racially based, we didn't manage to create that. And that's a real difference. It's a significant difference. But on the other side, the Roman narrative wasn't just about incorporating slaves, it was about incorporating everybody. So if you were conquered, yes, your situation was not great when you were conquered. But especially when you're talking about the later Republic and the Roman imperial period, if you were conquered, very quickly Rome would find a place for you in its ruling structure. So if you go now to, say, southern France, and you visit Lyon, or you visit the city of Sens, or even you visit like Bordeaux, you'll see remains from Romans whose grandfathers fought against Rome. Their fathers took Roman names, and the grandsons built amphitheaters. They built aqueducts. They built arches. They served in the Senate in Rome. Right? This is Rome's project. And what they managed to do was find a way to balance the injustice of the moment with the promise of a deeper integration in the future. And they delivered on that promise. There's a national narrative that we can embrace that is about redemption, inclusion, and creating a better society, because we as a country are able to recognize what other people can bring, and we can provide mechanisms for those people to be able to contribute their talents, their ideas, and their expertise to a society that embraces the common good, regardless of what background, what ideas, what sort of origins you have. And that's a Roman story that I think is something that our founders did see some similarities to.
And yet, you raised such a good point about the difference in slavery. Thomas Jefferson, who is the subject of a lot of my work, is complicit, let's say, deeply complicit in this argument. Because in Notes on Virginia, his famous book, his only book, he has two chapters on race and slavery. And in one, he says, this is an abomination. These are people that deserve to be free. It's incompatible with our system, et cetera, et cetera. And it's one of the most powerful abolitionist statements ever, and it was used by the abolitionist movement throughout the 19th century. But in the other passage, he says two things which are chilling. Number one, he says, this unfortunate business of color. And he talks about Rome and Greece and says, when they freed their slaves could intermingle with them, and there was no obvious distinction that this is a former slave. It was a much more blended world of enslavement than ours. Our people are black. They're black Africans, and that means that they can never probably shed the stigma of having once been an enslaved people. So he sees this as determinative. Now, I'm guessing he slightly misreads Rome, because there were distinctions of color and ethnicity and language and religion and so on, but he never says this unfortunate business of color. The second thing he says, Professor Watts, is even worse. He says, look, we have no absolute scientific way of determining this, but so far as one can tell, these black Africans are inferior to us white Nordics, both in body and mind. He says, I advance it as a suspicion only. We need more study. I hate to be condemning a whole race of people in this way, but here's what it seems like to me, Thomas Jefferson. when you read that, your heart just drops, right? This is the case, that blackness is a permanent stigma, and that there's a very good sense by the establishment of the founders that African Americans were not equals in any fundamental sense. Then how do you come out from under this? And you're saying Rome had mechanisms that made this possible that we simply haven't had. But we can see the lingering fallout of that right now in the discourse of the United States in 2024. And when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, a lot of us, and maybe you were one of them, I certainly was, thought, oh, we're entering a post-racial America. Well, that door was slammed hard into all of our faces, and it's even more appalling today, I think, than it was in 2008. The second thing, and I want to give you a chance to talk about all that, but the second thing is that when you're saying that when Rome conquered a group of people, there was a brutal period, but then these conquered peoples were allowed to become full members of the Roman world under certain circumstances. Our conquest of the indigenous people of America has not yet made that happen, although there are some wonderful signs of change. But for the most part, we conquered and locked native peoples into kind of a permanent otherness, and our attempts to assimilate were so ham-handed and so brutal that Native Americans resisted that and continue to resist that. In other words, maybe the jury is still out on this, but I guess one question is, if the founding fathers were so deeply imbued with Roman history, how did they not see opportunity?
Yeah, I think that the thing that is so challenging in this Roman story is it takes a very, very long time for this to unfold, and it's a different climate in that the color differences. I mean, there was a Moorish Roman emperor, Septimius Severus. We do have one painting of a Roman imperial family, and Septimius Severus is depicted in there as a dark-skinned African. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything in the Roman context except it doesn't mean what it would mean to us. And so the idea of color is not the same in a Roman context as it is in an American context. It takes a very long time for this all to fully kind of resolve itself. When Macrinus, who is the Moorish Roman emperor, takes power, you're in the 210s AD, right? You're 200 years after Augustus. So you are basically the distance from Thomas Jefferson to now. It's a very, very long time. And even Macrinus, there's significant concerns about him, but not because of his color or his background. The concern is his social status. And so what Romans managed to do is create a kind of idea of the structure of society and how people fit into it, where your national origin doesn't preclude you from being in a position of leadership, but it takes them a really long time to get there. But the answer is really compelling. The answer is, this is what we do. This is what we've always done. And why, when it's a moment to make this decision about incorporating new people at the highest levels of Roman society, why are we resisting now? What is it that makes us so resistant to do what we've always done? I hope that our conversations are going to proceed along those lines, where you have historically marginalized populations and the conversations become, well, why? Why in this context are we not doing what we've done for these other populations? And that's how Romans knew to frame that conversation, right? We have a historical narrative about who we are and what we do. And when something seems out of line with that, we use that basic idea of what our society is. It's a society that incorporates new people, and we use that as a check when somebody is doing something that is not consistent with it. And so what Claudius is not doing is saying, well, here are all of these events that add up to this. What he's saying is, this is our character. This is our national character. And I can show you incidents in the past where this national character is manifested, but we need to behave in a way that's consistent with this national character whenever there's a problem. And if you're going to resist something, you cannot resist it just because you have a feeling, when that resistance is inconsistent with who we are as a people. And so I guess that would be my answer, is we have, across the 250 years of US history, really struggled to live up to the basic ideals of what our nation should be and what our nation has been for certain immigrant groups. It is not uniformly applied, but that doesn't mean that the narrative should be scrapped. What it means is that narrative is a way for us to check something where we're not measuring up. Because for this to work effectively, for a society based on inclusion, incorporation, and maximizing the talents of everybody who can contribute to it, and maximizing the contributions that they make, That should be a standard that applies everywhere, or your society is missing something. It's not as good as it can be. And that's the fundamental thing that Romans brought up is, why are we better than Athens? Why are we better than Sparta? Because we're willing to see here's a guy over here who is not part of our polity, but has something to contribute. And we take them in and we give them a position where they can give us whatever contributions they can make. And we empower them to make those contributions, and we accept those contributions as ours. Athens didn't do it. Sparta didn't do it. These states that compete with Rome couldn't do it. Rome did it, and that I think is inspiring in a fashion that gets us out of a narrative focused on events, because now it's a narrative focused on character.
Yeah. So a couple of things, and then we're going to take a break, and then the third portion of the program, I want to ask you where our Virgil is going to come from here, and if it's as Milton said, maybe it's an age too late for that sort of epic narrative. But for the moment, you would have thought the United States was nearly identical. Europeans come here, every borders are open. People from all over have come here. The Irish came, Slavic peoples came, Germanic peoples came, other Norse peoples came. We have been a very aggregating civilization, and although each of these cultures is persecuted in the beginning, think of Irish Americans in the 1850s and 60s, or the Slavic peoples in New York in the 1890s, eventually their children turn out to be just like everybody else, and we give up being oppressive about those cultures. This has happened for every culture in our experience except African Americans. That's where this trope stalls every time. And again, it goes back, I think, to the founding fathers, and they were working from Enlightenment concepts of race that we now know were essentially corrupt. But we have built into our system a kind of a willingness to absorb everybody except African Americans. And that's the one haunting, unresolved question of American life. And the 1619 Project, although it's radical in some respects, is intended to say to us, this is the problem of American life. And you're not going to be able to fix this until you get over this. You've got to be able to get over this hump. And I think we're making some strides, frankly, although it doesn't feel like that right now. As we think about the base of the Statue of Liberty, Emma Lazarus's great poem, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. There are people on the right that say that should be taken off of that monument, that's not the American mission, that maybe it was true once, but we're full, we don't need any more, we got to slow this thing down. It's heartbreaking, isn't it, to see a very great nation that has existed precisely as Rome did, to absorb peoples from all over the planet, has gotten to the point now where it's in a deep anxiety about that very project.
Yeah, I think that, I absolutely agree with you about the fact that the groups, for example, when you look at like the 1968 election, and Richard Nixon had a campaign process where I don't remember the exact name of this, but it was something like Ethnics for Nixon.
Right.
And, and he had particular outreach, and he had identified ethnic groups, and, African Americans were one. I think it was Chicanos. It was a subgroup of Hispanic Americans. And then it was, Slavic and Irish and Jewish, and you're right that ethnics for Trump would not look the same as ethnics for Nixon. And again, these are the words from '68. These are not my words, but you're right that there is a process. And for some of the groups in 1968 that were seen as groups that you need to do particular outreach to, some of them still exist in that circumstance. I do think, though, that the way to continue to try to push is to say what Claudius said, right? We are not living up to who we are, and there are consequences to that. Our society is not as good as it could be, and it's not as productive, and it's not as creative, and it's not as dynamic because we aren't doing in a uniform way what we are doing in some contexts. And so I think a focus on a particular national character points out what's lost when you can't embrace this particular character and this particular set of ideals, because it's not abstract. That's what I think we miss when we make this a conversation about abstract values. It's also tangible. And the argument that worked in Rome is, look, there are these people who have things that can make us all better. We just need to figure out how to integrate them so they can contribute. And when you don't do that, you are making your society less wealthy, less productive, less dynamic, less interesting. It's worse. And if you have resources that you aren't optimizing, make an economic argument, make a justice argument, make whatever argument you need, but you have to point to the fact that there is a loss when there are citizens who are not fully empowered to contribute to the degree that their talents can. that is a loss to your society. And the Romans were very, very good at calling out the people who were making their society lose out on those things. And it's a similar kind of value to what we have.
Amazing. We got to take a break. I'm just so enjoying this conversation with Professor Edward Watts of UC San Diego, endowed professor of classics. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm talking with Ed Watts, my classicist friend who's just written a gigantic broad brush history of Rome. I can't wait to see it, but for those who might be interested, I really very strongly recommend your books. I've learned so much from them. Mortal Republic, How Rome Fell into Tyranny, and I'm really interested in the eternal decline and fall of Rome, the history of a dangerous idea. So Ed, all this chaos in Rome, I mean, most of the listeners are not that familiar, but from about 200 BC until about 14 or 27 AD, it was a nightmare world in Rome. Civil wars and pogroms and assassinations and mob actions and stormings of the forum and so on. It's hard for us even to get our brains around the amount of sheer violence that was central to that long, long period. One way to look at that is that Rome was, had a republican constitution in a time when it was now becoming an empire, and so there were just strains on its capacity to sort things out on so massive a scale with armies all over the known world. But whatever it was, something had to happen. Augustus comes in. Fortunately, he is on the whole a benevolent emperor, not a self-serving or criminal one. He was followed by such people, unfortunately. But he creates the Augustan settlement, and a number of artists and sculptors and poets and historians wind up creating a new narrative for Rome that says we're going to be okay. We don't have to jettison our past. Our past informs the present, but we needed peace and order, and now we have it, and now we can flourish again. How does the United States come out of this crisis? Because we don't have a narrative. If you went to Columbia University or Brown, University of Chicago, and did the list I gave of Columbus and Lexington and Concord and so on, you'd be sneered out of the room, because people would say that's not American history. That doesn't even begin to cover the chaos and the tragedy and the oppressions of American history. And although we can resist the extremes of that argument, it's clear that we can no longer ever really have the old Columbus, Daniel Boone narrative again. It wouldn't be an epic poem today, but we have film, we have television, we have a whole range of popular entertainments. What would knit this country back together with a consensus narrative that doesn't forget the bad things and the failures, but also can find a way to celebrate the larger American achievement?
This is an incredibly complicated question. And I guess the way that I would try to answer that is to first put ourselves in the 50s in Rome, where there isn't anyone. I mean, if you were to ask that question in Rome, could you imagine that in 50 years, you're going to have all of this stuff that ties everything together and we'll feel good about, who we are and where we've come from? Virgil's alive then, right? He's a teenager, but nobody would say that, right? If you read some of the stuff that Cicero was writing in the 50s and 40s, there's no path to that kind of idea that you see in Cicero's work. It's all about like, well, what could we have done to save this in the past, and when did it go wrong, and who could have fixed it? And when he writes on the Republic, he actually sets it back in 133 BC with Scipio Aemilianus, because he's like, well, that's the last moment we probably could have fixed it. There isn't anything that looks like the world you have 50 years later. And so I think that the first answer is it looks impossible right now, but it looked impossible then too. And I think what changed was, first of all, the trauma of the civil wars in the 40s and the 30s. It was so immense. It was just so terrifying, and it was so all-encompassing for so long. It's very hard to imagine anything that could come together because we are all so afraid of everything coming apart. But Romans were too. And so I think it's impossible to imagine what might be on the other side of that. But at some point, this will pass, right? At some point, things will stabilize, or they won't, and they will stabilize in some new configuration that won't be the United States as it is now. It might be, who knows? But at some point, the menace will pass, and when it does, artists will be free to speak about that change that they are feeling. One of the things that we, especially after the 1930s, really struggled with when considering the works of these poets working under Augustus is the impact that this had as propaganda. And it did, and it was propaganda, and Augustus was very happy for it. But I think these people are genuinely, the people writing for Augustus are also genuinely relieved. It's different. And artists who recognize a different experience in their life come up with ways to explore that and express that and convey that, because they have recognized that something remarkable has occurred and they want to create art that illustrates that shift. So what will it look like? I don't know. But it's, I think, quite possible that somebody alive right now will create something like that. But at some point, there will be a different moment. And the fact that we've been through this moment, and the people who are aware of what this feels like, they will be aware of when it feels like something different as well. And that will produce art. And I think that's what the Augustan moment was. It is propaganda, but it's also genuine art produced by genuine artists who genuinely feel something has changed and they want to use their talents as a creative person to illustrate that change and express that change and create some sort of monument that allows you to understand the experience when you are not having it, right? We 2000 years later can look back at what Virgil has done or what Horace has done, and we can see a moment that allows us to try to recapture some of the feelings that they had from coming out of this really horrible generation or 2 generation long deep unease.
So you sound to me like you are a cautious long-term optimist.
Roman history makes me that. That was the thing that I really wanted to try to understand. And that's why I wrote the history of the Roman state from beginning to end. I wanted to understand how you do that, right? How do you live in something where you're confident that whatever you're going through at the moment is survivable and the polity that you're a part of is going to come back together and figure out how to fix what went wrong. There's something remarkable about that. And I think that there were only a few moments in Roman history where Rome got lucky that somebody showed up at exactly the right time. And Augustus is one of those figures. Augustus is an incredibly rare historical figure who is both capable of being, and he's clear-headed in everything he does, whether it's the use of violence, and he understands how to build things that can, constructively recreate structures and create faith in those structures without killing people. That's not a common historical figure. And Rome got that figure at exactly the right time.
That's a strong statement, an incredibly rare historical figure. They don't come around very often. We haven't had too many of them in our 250-year history here in the United States. Abraham Lincoln,
Yep.
George Washington, Martin Luther King, perhaps. It's a short list. Even more to the point, think of how bad it had to get before it got better in Rome. You had lists in public of proscribed people that it was okay to kill. There were lots of the most prominent families in Rome had their patriarchs killed, and sometimes their sons too. I mean, this was not January 6, 2021, was it? That wouldn't even register
No.
in the Roman annals. That was just like a routine Tuesday in Rome of the last 2 centuries before Augustus. And so how bad does it have to get before everyone realizes, oh my God, we've got to let somebody bring order back to this thing?
I think the problem is somebody bringing order back to this thing is not, that is, so I think the problem is allowing somebody to bring order back to this thing turns what should be a system of processes, institutions, and structures to basically a dice roll. So one of the things that Roman historians do that I think is quite interesting to us and didn't resonate at all for most of the people working on Roman history after 1945 until really pretty recently, they would talk about, yeah, okay, there are these systems and there are these structures and there are these institutions and there are all these things we do, but there's also fortune, there's fortuna or tike. And like sometimes you have the army positioned appropriately, you have them prepared, they're well rested, the wind is at your back, and they run away. That's tike, right? There's no system that's going to prevent that. this is the challenge with saying someone will fix it. That's TK. That's fortune. It might happen. Augustus did happen. And that really, I think, saved the Roman state from completely falling apart. I think it is actually much more plausible that the Roman Empire turns, into three or four or five separate states that never come back together than that Augustus creates a new political system that is a functional evolution of the Republic. Augustus is very unlikely. The fact that Rome said, like, we're going to trust one person to do it and they got the right person, fortune. We should never do that.
So, short of that, how could Rome have been saved?
So I think that the closest analog that Rome had to January 6th was in 100 BC, when there's a consular election that gets disrupted because one of the losing candidates sends a mob in to prevent the votes from being counted. And then he goes to the Capitol. And so, it's a pretty close analog. You still have at that point 60 years, 65 years before really it becomes actually more of like 70 years before it becomes clear that Augustus is going to win. In that time, you have a degeneration into first a war between Rome and people who are part of the Roman economic system but are not part of its political system. This is the social war with Italian allies. That's a place that, Rome could have embraced its idea of incorporation, prevented that conflict. And if it prevented that conflict, it would have prevented Sulla. But it didn't. And so Sulla comes in, Sulla marches on Rome. He's the first general to lead his army against the Roman city. And Sulla creates a new constitution that could have ended this, but doesn't. You have a series of challenges to this in the 70s, but in the 60s, you have a generation of people who really, they don't like what Sulla did, but they really, really want the state to function. They just cannot come together to figure out how to do it. And that's the generation of Julius Caesar and Pompey and Crassus and Cato and Cicero that, they end up killing each other. I mean, they end up creating a civil war, a civil conflict, and that's a civil conflict that ultimately Augustus has to resolve. There are various off ramps, various places where you could have stepped off and said, we need to make our institutions do what they're supposed to do. And so if you start with the Saturninus moment and you say that's January 6th, there were all sorts of moments where Romans could come together and recognize we have a problem with a large number of Italian allies who are part of our economy, but we are making policies that affect their economic and legal interests without any input. And why? That's not what our state has always been about. That's not how we have traditionally functioned. We've just decided to abandon our best practices and our principles for no good reason. If you had had that off ramp, you actually would have prevented a lot of those problems. You might not have needed Augustus.
There had been off ramps for a couple of hundred years that could have made a smoother transition to a new way of looking at the Republic. It did not happen. And some of this is human agency, and some of this is just the way things fell out. But when you look at us today, for example, take the border. I think almost all Americans realize that we have a border problem. Now, just what the problem is unclear, and just what steps we could take to fix it are deeply debated and unclear. But I don't think the American people are ignorant of the fact that we have got to figure something out, a comprehensive immigration reform bill. This is doable. There are think tanks, there are philosophers, there are historians, this is a doable solution. And yet, again and again and again, we back away and allow things to get worse, and it becomes a deeper political divide until it probably is a determinative factor in the 2024 election. So we are ducking the chances to do things right, even though we have think tanks that the Romans would have given anything to have. We have publishing possibilities that they would have given anything to embrace. We have sophisticated understandings, including statistical understandings and demographic analyses. We have tools that the Romans didn't have and would have desperately wanted to have in their possession if they could have, and we can't do it. So where does the logjam break, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a great answer for that.
You're supposed to.
I know. So I think what I would say is it has to come organically from below. I recently it was actually really interesting. It was a salon event that was held by a couple of military families in San Diego. And it was really clear that, they are not my generation. They are not from where I grew up. They have very different experiences than me. But all of us really fundamentally, we just want to have a life. We just want our kids to be able to be raised without like being terrified of what's going to happen to them. And we just want to know that if we do X, the outcome is likely to be Y. And we can plan 5 years down the road and 10 years down the road in a system where we understand more or less what the rules are supposed to be. We all want that. So why don't we ask for that? Why we all know that there is something special about what this country can do in terms of finding talent, maximizing that talent, and making that talent useful for everybody. So we all have a better experience. We know that this country can do that and it has done that. So why don't we push for that?
Why don't we push for that?
Yeah, I think that's the answer.
But
right?
what
That's
is the
what
answer?
Romans.
So, to the mass grassroots movement, the people burble up and demand better, and they finally get it.
I think so. I mean, that's one way it could happen. Is it practical? I don't know how to do that. But this is what Romans did not do. What Romans did is they basically said, look, like things have been really good, and yeah, okay, we generally incorporate people, and yeah, we'll get around to incorporating the Italians. They started talking about that in 125 BC. The first time that was proposed is in 125 BC. It takes until 91 BC for this to explode, right? It is an entire generation and like a half where they're just like, yeah, we'll get around to it. We'll get around to it. We'll get around to it. We know it's consistent with who we are. We know it's good for us. We'll get around to it. They don't get around to it and it explodes. That's a complacency that comes out of a society that believes that, everything is more or less, the rules aren't going to change. And then suddenly they do. And so I think that this is, in a sense, the tyranny of the radical middle. We don't want the arguments that are happening on the left. We don't want the arguments that are happening on the right. We're not interested in arguments. I think that there has to be some fashion, some way for somebody to back a movement of the radical middle that says, in essence, there's a lot of stuff that, that works in this country. And if we're going to blow this country up, we're going to destroy a lot of systems that could be reformed and made better, but more or less provide us with what we're kind of hoping for as citizens in a society. The fact that we're now kind of facing sort of apocalyptic rhetoric on both, from both sides of the presidential campaign, it's not conducive to having those conversations that acknowledge there's a lot of things that work. They can work better. They should work better. We have principles that we don't live up to. But, maybe we're 80% there. So let's get the other 20% instead of destroying the 80% and starting at zero and hoping that somebody's going to show up who can fix it.
All right, Professor Edward Watts, we're out of time. The Aeneid was widely, if not universally, read. There's nothing in our culture like that. What's the book that you could count on everyone at UCSD having read? It's zero. There's not a movie that everyone watches. We have 500 television stations. I think we need people like you to say, I know history and I know what can go wrong. And there are ways in looking even at Roman history to find out what can go right. You don't have to respond to that, but I know you're either blushing or frowning. Of the books that you've written, which is the one you would recommend to my listeners that they will understand? They're not interested in Rome in the same way you and I are, but they are interested. Should they read Mortal Republic? Should they read The Eternal Decline? Or should they read The Final Pagan?
So I think that the question about the Aeneid is an important one, because what actually reifies the Aeneid's status as that is an educational system that really takes form in the first century and second century. But it really becomes important in the 4th century, when you have a structure where government bureaucrats are being trained in a very specific curriculum with very specific skills, and they are all reading the Aeneid. Right. So that's really kind of how you get there.
You have to have a common central text.
Have a common central text, but you're incentivized to participate in the reading of that text, because that's how you get a good job. So I think Mortal Republic is a very interesting way to think through events now without actually being hammered with them. It's a story. It's a Roman story. It is purely a Roman story. But I think the best thing that Rome can do is provide us with tools to think with. That's what I try to do in the way that I write about Rome, but it's also why Rome is so fascinating to me. I feel like I can understand the world around us better by looking at Rome, understanding some of its aspects of its life, and then seeing what's the same and what's different.
Amazing. That's a perfect way to end, because when I first encountered your book and called you about a week later, I read the book and Mortal Republic, and about every 7th or 8th page I thought, is he talking about them? And so you never made it explicit. You never said, hey, folks, look in this mirror. But that's the effect of it. And that's why it's so valuable, and that's why Rome is such a valuable story for all this. So, Ed, I hope you'll come back to do many more of these talks. I've loved this. Thank you so much, Dr. Edward Watts of the University of California at San Diego. We'll see you soon, my friend.
Thank you.
And we'll see all of you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.